Today on CityCast Chicago, we have talked a lot about the city's efforts to combine its shelter systems for new arrivals and people experiencing homelessness. But how has that actually played out in neighborhoods? We're talking with a couple of reporters who'd followed one such shelter in Hyde Park. It's Monday, June 2nd. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. I'm joined by Zoe Farrow, a reporter with the Hyde Park Herald. Welcome to CityCast Chicago.
Thank you for having me.
Also in the building is the editor-in-chief of the Southside Weekly, Jackie Serrato. Jackie, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me back. Glad to be here.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Zoe, you all have both worked together on a story where you all got to actually sit down and interview people who have been living in the shelter in the old Best Western Hotel off of Lakeshore Drive. My brother actually lives like a block and a half away from here. I used to live at the towers right across the street from here. And currently plans are being finalized to make it a permanent shelter. But let's start how we got here. When did this shelter first open and who was it for originally?
The first shelter that, the city opened for migrants to Chicago in Hyde Park was in September of 2023. And that one was actually in the former Lakeshore Hotel. And then a year later, so in the summer of 2024, was when the state opened a second temporary shelter. And that was, again, just for refugees and asylum seekers who made their way or were sent to Chicago from the southern border. And that was in the Best Western Hotel. And then, so the Lakeshore Hotel that was originally opened closed last October as part of the plans to decompress shelters as the pace of migration to Chicago was slowing. But the Best Western has still stayed open, as you said.
At its height, Zoe, how many families, how many new arrivals were staying in particularly the Best Western Hotel, maybe at its height?
It was initially around 400 residents that were staying there. And there's a lot of families we've heard. It has a capacity to go up to roughly 700 people. And actually, that's been kind of a point of discussion because one of the politicians who's been working on this has asked that they lower that limit that's currently, around 700.
You all spoke with the Rojas family who came to Chicago about a year ago after leaving Venezuela, and then with Takia Millbrooks, who grew up in South Shore and now stays at the shelter with her children. Can you talk about some of the surprising things you learned in these interviews? Jackie, we can start with you and then back to you, Zoe.
Yeah, for me, it was just surprising, just the resiliency with which they spoke. The fact that they had to cross multiple borders, maybe 7+ borders, just to arrive to Chicago is mind-blowing to me. But also just how pleased they were to be treated like human beings here in Chicago and in the shelter in particular, instead of cargo or animals or a nuisance or just, a statistic. Both of the parents have jobs. The teenage child is now successfully enrolled in a CPS high school. They've moved out of the shelter, rented their own apartment. So, they're living like, your average Chicago resident.
All of us in this conversation, so many of our colleagues, many community organizers have been following this for over 3 years now, since Republican governors and politicians on border states started sending new arrivals to Chicago, which started with people staying on the floor of police shelters, staying on the floor of airports. And then the process of opening and resourcing these shelters became a huge problem. Getting them put up in neighborhoods across the city a hassle would be the easiest way of saying it. But it caused a lot of political and neighborhood dissension. Zoe, when this shelter originally went up in Hyde Park, how did residents respond?
There's been, kind of from the beginning of any of the shelters in the neighborhood, the Lakeshore Hotel, and now the Best Western, we've seen, a lot of anger from neighbors. The biggest thing is that the complaint that people have is that the city didn't consult them beforehand about the placement of shelters. In a meeting that Alderman Yancey held in February, the city said that, they were responding to a sudden humanitarian crisis that they were facing. So they didn't really have the time to consult people. But that is, I would say, the kind of the top line complaint of residents. In addition, residents have a lot of quality of life and concerns about property values, with which the city has also kind of said, this won't affect property values. But people, have complained of trash and loitering and petty theft and, some vending activity and noise and things like that.
I do understand like the concern with the city kind of like imposing a shelter, almost overnight, especially around the school that was turned into a shelter, Wadsworth, which is not in Hyde Park, but it's nearby in Woodlawn.
Mm-hmm.
This was a school that was shuttered by the city under Rahm Emanuel. It's not been set up for like community use in any other way, and then suddenly it becomes a shelter. So I understand people's anger in that regard, where there is obviously a community building, a public building that could have been used years ago for the benefit of the community.
And it also shows how quickly the city can mobilize resources to house people, to reopen buildings, to bring in operations, to take care of people, things that folks have been asking for years and decades in these communities.
Great point. Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that really pissed people off, that, they know that the city could have intervened much earlier to provide resources, to provide even recreational space for the neighborhood. However, I do feel like the anger is misdirected. It's being directed at the migrants themselves, when they honestly have no context of that political background.
And I guess the other thing I want to add is there are also definitely residents who are supportive of the shelters in their neighborhoods. And, I've spoken with people who feel that way as well. I think sometimes, the more vocal contingent is, the people in opposition. And in this case, they've formed under a formal name within the neighborhood and, are thinking, working towards putting forth a lawsuit. So see, there is movement that we've seen, that I think makes it so it seems like there's a lot of opposition. But I just wanted to also note that there are people who are supportive.
When you all talk with like the members of the Rojas family, could they feel, in addition to the chaos of their own situation, could they feel this maybe pushback from the city, that this chaos around how are we going to pay for this? Where is the shelter going to be put up? Or when they got here, was there this feeling that, not only was the city welcoming, but that organizations and community members had their back in some respect?
They were largely insulated from a lot of those protest efforts, because they were not necessarily part of the town halls. A lot of the narrative was in English. Right. So I remember at one point I asked them, have you heard any racial slurs? Have you felt any discrimination? And they were like, no, in our day to day, going to and from work, even taking a walk outside of our home, we haven't, come across anyone who has spoken ill, who has told us to go back home. They had no indicator of anyone ever being discriminatory or racist against them. What they did hear would usually come from the news when they were watching, the news on TV, or they would overhear it from coworkers and, from third parties, basically. But they had no direct experience getting that kind of pushback. I was particularly kind of blown away by how Juliana, the 15-year-old, how much she loved the neighborhood, so much so that she insisted on going to Kenwood Academy for high school. And she's someone who has already been to high school in different countries. I think she mentioned Colombia being one of them, Venezuela being another one. And a lot of Latin American countries are known for their classism. And she was speaking to how welcome she felt at Kenwood, how teachers and her fellow students were so willing to help her understand the language, to point her in the right direction. And she said that this is an experience that she did not have in some of these Latin American countries that she went through. So, it's interesting hearing it from a teenager, right? Because it didn't seem like she was trying to sugarcoat anything. She was just giving her real experience, which up until this point had been very positive.
Now, I really appreciate the work that you both have done and all of your colleagues to really sit down with people and flesh this out, because, of course, a positive experience at school or meeting somebody in the neighborhood or a positive experience navigating the shelter system isn't going to make the same amount of waves as, hey, we might file a lawsuit against this. Zoe, when did this shelter in Hyde Park, when did lawmakers decide that it would be used for the one shelter system for both new arrivals as well as people experiencing homelessness throughout the city every single day?
Yeah, so the Johnson administration announced it's the One System Initiative plan, and they announced it in October, but it actually went into effect in December, effectively. So that's when the Best Western Shelter also transitioned to welcoming both people who are migrating to the city and combined it with permanent residents. There are now 5 integrated shelters like that across the city.
Zoe, can you talk a little bit about what you learned from these interviews, not only with the Rojas family, but talking with Takia, who since the shelter became integrated with new arrivals and longstanding residents of the city, she has since taken up residence in the shelter. Can you talk about what you learned speaking with her?
Takia Millbrooks, I think is a good example of just kind of the challenges of the rental market, frankly, that we continue to see rise. Because I think for her, she's a single mother and she has 4 kids who all attend. When she moved into the shelter, they attended a school on the west side. And she still wants them to attend that same school, which is, understandable. A lot of parents want consistency for their kids. And so, she's currently not only single parenting, but also doing that commute with them because they're all very young still. And is also currently on disability. So, there are multiple challenges kind of intersecting with her financial situation, but it's obviously very hard to find an apartment given, even on disability, given her current situation. It's going to be very challenging to find something in her price range in the area or in surrounding areas. So her situation highlights how the conditions are still often very challenging within shelters too, with young kids. Food can be a challenge sometimes, finding things that they like or that are appropriate. And also she, said that they were living with another family for a while who they had a disagreement with. So, quarters are often cramped in the shelters and there's still definitely, challenges and people do, want to move out and are hoping for that mobility.
So I asked them about the conditions in the hotel. And they said how there might be this misconception that it's luxury and, people are living like in a fancy room in a former hotel. But they were talking about how there are multiple families cramped into a room, and they don't have access to television. They don't have access to like any type of technology or perks, right, that a hotel guest would normally have. So yes, it might have been a hotel at some point, but the way that it's being run, it doesn't feel like a hotel. It feels like maybe a hostel at best, right? But they're all sharing rooms, they're all sharing bathrooms, they're all sharing resources, at every level.
I mean, up to this point, the city and the state have been jointly operating this shelter, but it will revert entirely to city operation by the end of this month. Zoe, how will that change things?
It's a little bit hard to tell how much or how little things will change, because, certainly the city and state level politicians who have weighed in on this will continue, to be involved and probably voice their opinion. But the big thing that could potentially change is the operator. Currently, New Life is the operator of the shelter, or, is doing the most work within the shelter to do day-to-day operations and also to work on programming. They do a lot of programming, both for kids and adults within the shelter. So the big thing for that is that the city has they've already released their request for proposals for operators. But I do know that I was speaking with someone actually earlier today who is, an employee of New Life. And she was saying that they have submitted a bid as part of the process. And, a number of other organizations have also submitted bids. So soon we should have the news of, whether there's going to be a different face, kind of behind the Best Western Shelter, and operators. Operators are really important because, we saw Borderless did some very good reporting about how favorite healthcare staffing who used to operate many of the shelters, kind of the pitfalls of their operations because, conditions were rather poor when they were in charge. So operators are just very important. So that is something, I guess, to stay tuned to see who the city ends up choosing for that.
Jackie, as you've listened to both the support and concerns of residents over the last few years, both around this particular shelter, but overall, the city's attempts to provide more resources for new arrivals. Has that conversation shifted at all over the last few years?
I think it has shifted, and it's largely because the number of Venezuelan migrants that are arriving to the city has fallen. We don't have the exact numbers because the city at some point was keeping us updated through a dashboard that they kept updating on a regular basis, but they've since stopped providing those numbers. But we have seen like a drop in migration and buses arriving to the city, so that urgency to house hundreds or thousands of people is no longer there. Plus, I think the narrative has shifted a little bit as the city and the state have stepped up to respond to just the surge of people arriving to Chicago. It was not a perfect process. There's definitely a lot of room for criticism or for us to like evaluate how things could have been done better. But just the fact that the city responded positively by attempting to shelter so many families, and in some ways was successful in doing that.
As you all have talked to neighbors, gotten into a little bit of the opposition that, as we've said, has gotten way more attention than the positive experiences that people have had navigating through the city. But even the alderperson, the local state rep have come out and tried to slow things down, if not stop them altogether. One neighborhood group has threatened a lawsuit, as we've alluded to. Are any of these efforts likely to yield any substantial change to the city's plans?
I think it's hard to say. I would say it seems like a lot of the politicians who have gotten involved, like Tarver and Peters and Yancey, have all kind of made specific asks of how the city will move forward with it. So it seems like even they are not kind of really saying like, we need this to stop. They're just saying that we need you to, take residents' concerns seriously.
Jackie, it's been nearly 3 years since buses began arriving in Chicago. When this was all first unfolding, it was very chaotic. It got a lot of attention. But since the city is shutting down the New Arrivals Project, absorbing it into other aspects that we've discussed, what do you think is most important as we hit this phase, as less Chicagoans are talking about it? We're not getting daily updates with dashboards, but this is still thousands of people who are looking for resources to navigate the city and build a new life.
I think this is a really crucial moment for the city to step up and ensure that they are getting community and public input. But also, whenever the city is going to take a public building and use it for something, I hope they come up with a process where at least the local alderpersons are like fully involved and communicating with their constituents, so that we can avoid a lot of the tension that we saw. But also, I think thinking about like foreign policy, right? How it's easy for us to think of foreign policy as something that does not affect our daily lives. But clearly there's, some politics in place happening between the U.S. government and the Venezuelan government, which even I don't understand 100%. But, those policies are directly contributing to the reason why people are migrating in the first place. So I think it's important when we're just talking about immigration, it's important to think about, well, what is prompting so many people to arrive to the country and to Chicago in such large numbers? Like, what has changed? How has U.S. policy affected their home country?
I want to give a huge thank you to both of our guests today. From the Hyde Park Herald, Zoe Farrell. Zoe, it was great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been very fun.
And the editor-in-chief of the Southside Weekly, Jackie Serrato. Jackie, good to see you again, my friend.
Thank you, Colby, and thanks for covering these issues.
Before we get out of here, please bookmark our website, chicago.citycast.fm. I'm literally staring at it right now. You can catch up on old podcast episodes, subscribe to our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago. You can take our weekly news trivia quiz. You can check out our guide to Chicago for June 2025. Check out our events calendar. We got so much on the website. It's all for you. It's all free, so go check it out now. One more thing. some good news. I want to give a shout out to all of the good people over at Monday Coffee in North Lawndale. It's not just a coffee shop, it's a community space, a shared work environment. And tomorrow they're going to have their weekly Tuesday chess club. All you got to do, show up ready to play some chess. As always, I appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace. Don't, we got more sirens in the back.